Hello from a very cold Saddleworth in the UK. So in today's video I am going to do a book review. At the beginning of the year, when I asked for feedback on what you'd like to see more of this year on my YouTube channel, art books was one of the things that came up. And the book that I have chosen is this wonderful book from David Mankin called Remembering in Paint. And this is actually a collaboration book which has actually been written by Kate Reeve-Edwards in conjunction with Mankin. So this is all about his approaches to painting, and it's full of his wonderful imagery of his works. This book was first published in 2021 and I received it soon after then. But until recently I've been dipping into it sporadically really. And it's only now when I'm going through it chronologically that I really get to appreciate the depth and information that is in this book. And so without further ado, I'm going to put the camera over the desk and share it with you. So this is the book, and I should just say at the beginning here, it's beautifully produced. It's wonderful thick paper and the images are stunning and really clear and interestingly laid out. So it's really beautifully produced. But ultimately, this is a book about Mankin's process and the art processes that he goes through to develop his wonderful evocative paintings of Cornwall. It's set up chronologically in terms of the way that Mankin goes about developing his paintings. And so I'm going to dip into each of these sections. It starts with a wonderful dialogue between the author and Mankin as they go out into the landscape together and then come back to the studio to do some painting. And then subsequently it takes us through how Mankin goes from being out in the landscape through to his processes, how he sort of collects his sort of inspirations, if you like, and how he works on them. And then this third section is all about the development of the canvases, and then finally looking at paintings. So I will sort of whistle stop tour through all of them. But the first thing I just wanted to mention, the first thing is the introduction by Kate. And the thing I just wanted to say is that this book is all about process, about the processes that Mankin takes. And I quote here, she says, "The process for Mankin is all important. He paints to problem solve, discover, learn, rather than to produce a perfect final image." And I think that's, you know, very much the sentiment of the book. And then subsequently, I mentioned that the director of Cornwall Contemporary has a viewpoint here, Sarah Britton Mansbridge, and one of the things that she says in talking about how collectors appreciate Mankin's paintings: each painting is a remembered moment, a glimpse of a feeling evoked by being in the landscape. David isn't illustrating the landscape in a representational way. There's no attempt to recreate a specific view. Instead, he explores beyond its obvious beauty and manages to express the emotion of how it feels to stand in a Cornish field in the summer sun, or on a beach after a storm has passed. While making us understand how it feels to be there, he captures more than a momentary glimpse into a vista or on everyday life in Cornwall. He allows us to tie our own thoughts and memories of the landscape into each piece. In this first section, Kate goes down to Mankin's studio in Cornwall to meet him. And so there's the sort of wonderful descriptions in this section of the studio itself, of the fact there's blue paint everywhere, there are stacks of this flotsam piled up, and all sorts of descriptions of the studio itself. And then she talks about going out into the studio, from the studio, along the coastal path. She says, "David takes me to the coastal path. It's a route I've been on before, but I've never noticed so much." And they go along the coastal path, and she asks him how he sees, and he talks about imagining he's a cormorant swooping through the landscape. And so you get this sort of dialogue, but you also start to get an understanding of Mankin and the way that he thinks and the way he works. And she talks about the drawings that they both produce in these sketchbooks. And she says, unlike my rigid drawings, he has detached actual size from the objects he draws. And in this way, he uses the small elements to describe the big, which is something that Mankin does. And then she asks him about what abstraction is, and he says, you know, because he wants to translate not just what he sees, but what he feels about what he sees. And this is abstraction, and how they express the feelings about what you physically experience, as he says. And throughout this chapter, you hear a lot about Mankin and how he has developed as an artist, and how he came back to art. He drew as a child, and then it wasn't until 2012 that he had the opportunity to start developing his work. And you see all this lovely imagery all the way through, this black and white imagery of him as a child in the studio, the visuals through the windows, and that's another one there. And you get also this clarification of how his story developed and how he was approached in 2016 to exhibit at Cornwall Contemporary. But then they go back to the studio and they start painting, and that's when you start also realising and understanding a little bit about how Mankin works. And he talks about crunching up wires and scratching it through the paint, and doing big scratches, and being very sort of gestural with his work. And then again, she gets frustrated. And then it's an interesting thing. She says here, in obliterating my work, I moved it on, because she covers with paint. And this is what Mankin does. So in this chapter, not only do we get this introduction, but we also start to understand how it is that he is working. And that continues in the subsequent chapters. So this next section is very much about how Mankin takes his thoughts and ideas and inspirations from out in the landscape back all the way through to the canvas, really. So in the first instance, this chapter does talk quite a bit about the landscape that inspires Mankin, about how his paintings begin and end with the Cornish landscape, and then talks in some detail about the landscape, including his views on it and his inspirations of it. Paintings are referenced all the way through the book, and certainly in this chapter as well. And also other painters and how they're inspired by the landscape, and also how they compare with Mankin. And then subsequently, there are a number of pages which describe how he documents his experience, and that starts with photographs. And he takes lots of images out in the landscape, and it talks about how those are used as a springboard for composition. And then subsequently it talks about how he goes out and he collects things from the landscape in a process of beach combing. So he actually collects, bits of drift, bits of flotsam, things that get washed up by the sea, and how those get incorporated into his work. And subsequent to that, it also describes his sketching process, how his process often starts with sketching, and that is often in the landscape, but it's not always in the landscape. And it goes through in some detail describing how he does that, and how he sees them, and how he creates those images. And subsequent to that, it then talks about his works on paper, which are a step on from the sketches, and they are more about a development of an image, and these are more akin to the works on canvas, and they help him tap into his exploration and understanding of the subject. And there are examples all the way through describing how that's done. And it finishes in this section with some discussion of collage, and how sometimes his works on paper aren't finished, but they end up being cut up and then used in an experimental approach to see how things can combine together. So in this section, the final process chapter, we learn how, having understood what interests him about the landscape, what the landscape wants to say, what experiments he might want to push, he applies those ideas collectively to the canvas. And it's when he starts a canvas, it talks in some detail about that sort of start point to create the underpainting, and how it's a real beginning, and he's attacking the canvas, and it's about expressing, and it's about gestural marks and expressing himself in an intuitive gestural way. And it talks in some detail about that and the purpose of that. And once he has done that, he will often leave the work for a while before coming back to it. And it does talk about the fact that the beginning layers will throw out what is the artist is really interested in. And if he's not careful, although it's very exciting, if he's not self-controlled about it, it may be that he loses the painting and it becomes muddy and messy. And it's that why he says it's important to stop himself, so he pulls himself back from that. So throughout this chapter it talks about this sort of this process of, you know, the gestural and the energetic versus the standing back and thinking and exploring. And it talks about slowing himself down so that he can understand what the painting is trying to say, and describes how, on the one hand, he's asking himself the questions to make sure he's communicating the experience of the landscape. But at the same time, in the same stage, he's also switching mindset to a more objective approach, so that he's working out the formal qualities of the painting, and whether it's working compositionally and the mark making variety and the tonal qualities and so on. And he talks about the fact that, and he talks about how he approaches that and how he turns the canvas, and about the importance of the not doing stages and the reflection. And during this process of reflection, he does, I mean, throughout this chapter as well, just to mention, there is contrast with other painters. For example, Mondrian in this case, who was much more focused on the discovery and the problem solving rather than the finished piece. And that's true, and it reflects the fact that that is similar for Mankin. And he, at this sort of period of reflection, he does look a lot at poetry, and he reads it and he writes it, and the Shakespeare and Tennyson and Keats and all of this. And then a line in the poetry might well provoke him to sort of send the painting in a different direction. So it can be very influential. And throughout this chapter as well, some of Mankin's paintings are referenced. For example, this one, Impermanent Shadows, which it shares the descriptions of and how it changed dramatically from start to finish. And it uses that as a way of explaining how it's important to continually destroy, rework and change the paintings until they're saying what you want them to say. This idea of which is similar to Lanyon. And then he talks about this idea of the art being a process of learning, and the sort of like the back and forth as you evolve and develop the ideas of the painting, and so that it says what you want it to say. And so that's referenced as well, and it talking about it being painting being a kind of alchemy. Then in the latter two pages, it just talks about how Mankin is, as he becomes more confident, is able to navigate the process of painting to a greater extent. And it just talks a little bit as well about some of the artists that inspire him and whose work he studies as a way of understanding more about the process, including people like Willem de Kooning, Richard Diebenkorn and Robert Motherwell and others. And then this last section of the book is really Mankin's paintings set chronologically. So I'm just literally going to flick through them as I finish the video. I think you'll have got the impression that I think this is a highly readable and inspiring book. So if you have an interest in landscape painting, in abstract painting, there is a lot to study in these individual paintings, and they're set out in a lovely, clear way, and you can really look at them until your heart is content. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.